It's really wonderful to be here, talking to many of you who I know and many others that I don't. And I should say that I'm feeling really well, but I'm at the very end of a cold which has kind of settled in my chest. So I'm going to try really hard not to amplify any coughs in your direction. Um, I've been, of course, thinking about what to say to you, this particular audience. What would be interesting and useful for an audience affiliated with the work of Medea and similar places in the area. And I decided not to focus on the things that I've learned from many of you, and that would therefore be very familiar to you. For example, participatory or cooperative design, either as it was established and has developed so generatively here in Scandinavia, or the ways in which my colleagues and I at Xerox PARC in the 1980s and the 1990s tried to enact participatory design in our own context within the Silicon Valley. I'm very glad to discuss that afterwards. But I'm going to focus instead on perspectives that I have found inspiring in thinking about what in design terms we call the interface of people and artifacts. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about information artifacts very broadly construed. So that means that I'm going to be drawing more from the interdisciplinary field of science and technology studies and paying particular attention to the issues that I've called out in my title. That is the restoration of a sense of the place of bodies, both human and non-human bodies, in the figure of information, and its consequences for our thinking about media artifacts and practices. And I start with this image, and I owe a debt to Andre Dagny, who's here, for having alerted me to the existence of this very wonderful art installation. It's an installation called Standard Time by Mark Formanek, a German artist based in Berlin. I came across it actually as Andre and I were walking down the street in Berlin, and it was being played on a video loop in a window, and I said, "What's that?" And I subsequently found a short clip on YouTube, which I'm going to start by playing for you. And it has no sound, and it's 2 minutes, so we're just going to watch. Okay, that's the end of that clip. So, as you might guess, this piece runs for 24 hours. And it consists of this group of laborers in hard hats who appear every minute to reconstruct this analog realization of a digital clock in such a way that it keeps time accurately. And I love the fact that the people working on the two take long enough that the people who need to change the 0 into a 1 have to come on at the same time that they're finishing the 2. So you can actually, watch I've ordered the 24-hour CD of it. And I think it's so wonderful. I could actually probably talk for an hour about what I think are the implications of this piece. But I'll just use it to set up the project that I want to try to elaborate in my talk. As I said, that of restoring a sense of materiality, of bodies, and of labor to our thinking about information artifacts. And my title, as some of you might have recognized, is inspired by Catherine Hale's discussion in her book, How We Became Posthuman, of what she identifies as the emptying out, the erasure of body and materiality from the field of informatics in the early days of the field's formations. So one of the things that she does in the book is an extended account of the proceedings of the Macy Conferences on Cybernetics, which were a series of 10 meetings that were held between the years 1946 and 1953. And I'll come back in a moment to say more about this image on the right, which Hales presents in her book as a photo from one of these conferences. In a paper published in the journal Social Studies of Science in 1993, titled How to Be Universal, Some Cybernetic Strategies, the historian of science Jeff Bowker also looks at this question of the emerging information sciences, and he looks as well at the Macy conferences. Here's another image. This is the closing conference at Princeton in 1953. The woman in the front row, third from the left, is the anthropologist Margaret Mead. There's one other woman in the picture at the end of the second row, Janet Fried, who was the assistant for the conference. And there are lots of other famous cyberneticians there I won't bother to point out. Jeff, in his article, is interested in the practical and the rhetorical tools by means of which he argues that the field of cybernetics, which was celebrated for its interdisciplinarity, by implication for its diversity, although we might want to ask some questions about that from this photo, how that field managed to assert its universal relevance. And he describes how embracing Norbert Wiener's definition of cybernetics as, quote, the science of communication and control, whether in machines or living organisms, cyberneticians declared a new age in which Darwin's placement of man as one among the animals would now be followed by cybernetics' placement of man as one among the machines being the all-encompassing category. We should also note that Norbert Wiener himself paid very careful attention to questions of labor and actually cautioned against the too broad application of models that were designed in relation to physical or computational systems to the social world. He argued that the social world has particular forms of contingency and indeterminacy that mean that the same assumptions don't hold. But most of his colleagues at the time were not at all in the mood for any kind of caution. So here's one enthusiast. This is cybernetician Gordon Pask with one of his favorite machines, really fabulous machine maker. And he wonders at the way in which, quote, precisely the same arrangement of parts in the computer can represent the spread of an epidemic, the spread of rumors in a community, the development of rust on a piece of galvanized iron, and diffusion in a semiconductor. And Jeff Bowker observes that it's exactly this kind of heterogeneous list that came to be associated with much cybernetic writing. And a crucial move that underwrote these analogies between very, very differently materialized processes, so we have biological, social, chemical, electronic, was the assertion that information can be coherently considered apart from its instantiation in specific bodies, that the latter is kind of secondary. And to begin to challenge this premise, that the specific materialization of information is secondary to its sense and coherence, we can turn first back to this image that I showed earlier. As Catherine Hales closes her discussion of the Macy conferences, she brings a heretofore absent figure onto the stage. The person I mentioned before, the conference assistant and transcriptionist Janet Freed, who Hales identifies as the woman in the center of the tables in this photograph from the 1953 meeting. And she describes this photograph, and she writes, thinking of her, that is, thinking of Janet Freed, I'm reminded of Dorothy Smith's suggestion. Dorothy Smith is a sociologist, feminist sociologist. Dorothy Smith's suggestion that men of a certain class are prone to decontextualization and reification because they're in a position to command the labor of others. Take a letter, Miss Freed, he says. Miss Freed comes in. The man speaks. She writes on her stenography pad or perhaps her stenography typewriter. The man leaves. He has a plane to catch, a meeting to attend. When he returns, the letter is on his desk, awaiting his signature. From his point of view, what has happened? He speaks, giving commands or dictating words, and things happen. A woman comes in, marks are inscribed onto paper, letters appear, conferences are arranged, books are published. Taken out of context, his words fly by themselves into books. The full burden of the labor that makes these things happen for him is only an abstraction, a resource diverted from other possible uses, because he is not the one performing the labor. Miss Freed has no such illusions. She knows that words can never make things happen by themselves. They can't put marks on paper. They can't get letters in the mail. They can't bring 25 people together at the right time and in the right place, where white tablecloths and black chalkboards await them. For that, material and embodied processes must be used. So it's understanding the place of material and embodied processes in knowledge making that's been such a central project for science and technology studies over the past several decades. And in the remainder of my talk, I'm going to draw on a series of examples to try to set out this approach to recovering the body, the materiality of information, and why we need to see the body of information as inseparable from its intelligibility. And I'll start with this image. It's taken from Bruno Latour's 1999 collection of essays, Pandora's Hope. And the figure comes from chapter 2, which is titled Circulating Reference, in which Latour describes the work of Brazilian botanists who are trying to understand processes that are happening at the boundary of the savanna and the forest in Amazonia. They're trying to figure out whether the forest is encroaching into the savanna or the other way around. And this is a snapshot of one of the scientists that's taken in the field. It's a bit hard to see, but it's a woman. She's holding a big bunch of plants in her arms. And Latour's question is, what is it that makes this collection of flora that she's holding onto not, say, a bouquet, but a reference sample that is evidence for something else other than themselves? And the answer, he argues, is not something that we could determine by closely inspecting that bunch of plants. However closely we looked at them, we couldn't find the answer, because the answer of what makes this a specimen is that it's incorporated into one practice and not another. It's that incorporation into the activities that gives this this collection of plants its significance. So how then does this collection of plants get translated into botanical information? Latour asks. And he suggests that it does that through being part of a practice of making collections, of making reference libraries of specimens. And he makes this observation that, quote, we always forget that the word reference comes from the Latin referre, to bring back. So Latour then takes us back to the Botanical Laboratory in Manaus, and he shows us this cabinet, which is holding botanical samples that were brought back from the field, translating them into a kind of information repository for subsequent reference. And he observes that this image, we can see this image as displaying both hardware and software. That is, we have a cabinet designed in such a way to provide spaces that order and separate things. And the cabinet creates then a system of classification. It materializes a system of classification. So here's one way of recovering information's body, that is by attending to the material practices through which, in this case, chains of reference get made, connections from one thing to another. And another of the information artifacts that Latour talks about in this same chapter is this one on the right. It's called a Munsell color chart of universal color categories. It's used within sciences that are concerned with soil. This is an image from a study of a really wonderful study by Charles Goodwin of archaeologists at work in a paper of his titled Professional Vision. So the Munsell color chart is a very, very widely used device within the sciences for people who are interested in coming up with a standardized code of what color particular kind of soil is, because there are a lot of things that can be derived from that. And in his in this article, Goodwin analyzes, he argues that archaeological knowledge is made up of the relations between particular practices and their associated materials and tools. And it's out of those relations, he argues, that both the objects of archaeological knowledge and the body of the competent archaeologist are co-constructed. So he describes how one routine activity for participants in the archaeological digs that he was observing involves taking soil samples from a site that's under excavation and categorizing, coding their color, and as an aid to analyzing things like the age of the particular stratum that they were taken from, the material composition of that stratum, which could in turn contribute to inferences about things like land usage or artifacts and the like. But he goes on to describe in some detail how this device actually gets used. And using this device, again, involves more than just looking at it. It's actually got, it's a bit like some of you who've been perhaps trying to decide which of the 11,000 colors of white you want to paint your living room may have had the experience of getting paint samples. And it's like that. So it actually has holes cut under each of the colors. And Goodwin describes how, as an archaeologist, you put a bit of soil onto your trowel, your little shovel, and then you spray it with a bit of water to bring out the color, and then you move it around behind the holes on the chart until you find the closest enough match. And he also describes the problem, of course, of using this chart in that the colors of real dirt never actually quite match any of these ideal types. So it's learning how to find what counts as a good enough match, he argues, that is part of what's involved in bringing archaeologists' perception into the services of professional archaeology, learning how to see like an archaeologist. And that's the sense of professional vision that he's talking about. But there's another really important message here, which is about about what do we take to be our units of analysis. So if we're talking about this device, what are the sort of, what's the extent, what are the boundaries of this device? And I have another rather dramatic example that I'm fond of for making this point. When I use this example to an audience from the United States, I don't have to say anything about the text on the edges of the image. Guns don't kill people, people kill people, because this is the slogan of the National Rifle Association, which is the big lobbying group in the United States that's dedicated to protecting the right of Americans to carry firearms. So very, very familiar slogan. And it's obviously a slogan that's about the question of how we allocate responsibility between people and things. So the National Rifle Association argues, guns are innocent. The problem is, you've got to worry about bad people. You don't want to just go indiscriminately regulating the use of guns. And the image in the center. I put up because for people of my generation, again, who grew up in the United States, this is a kind of iconic image of the use of a gun. This is a moment, the man in the sweater who's being escorted is Lee Harvey Oswald, who was the man who was accused of assassinating John F. Kennedy. And this is a moment when we were all glued to our television sets. It was the day or so after the assassination when Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred from one facility to another. And on live TV, Jack Ruby, the man in the hat, appeared from out of nowhere and assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald. So as I say, it's an iconic picture of a gun, and I give it to you to look at, and then I'm going to read another quote from Bruno Latour, because in Pandora's Hope, he uses the case of the gun to think about this question of responsibility in the use of technology. And he says, "You are different with a gun in your hand. The gun is different with you holding it. You are another subject because you hold the gun. The gun is another object because it has entered into a relationship with you. The gun is no longer the gun in the armory, or the gun in the drawer, or the gun in the pocket, but the gun in your hand. If we study the gun and the citizen together, we realize that neither subject nor object is fixed. When the two are articulated, they become someone/something else." So the moral that I take from this story is, as I said, it's about what we take to be our unit of analysis. And the implication of this is that we can't actually separate persons and guns and consider questions of responsibility in relation to one or the other. The critical point here is that we have made something new. When we create the person with their gun in their hand, we have a new form of agency, a new capacity for action, a new configuration that didn't exist before, and it enables new things to happen. And when we think about whether those are things we do or don't want to happen, we have to think about that assemblage of subject and object together. So trying to think through the implications of this premise is one of the inspirations for my book, Human-Machine Reconfigurations, in which I trace out the implications for our thinking about the human-machine interface as a site where agency gets delegated across people and things. So let me just pursue that a little bit further. This is the cover image from the book, an image that I really love. It's an automaton designed by Al-Jazari, who is an Arab scholar. His manuscript of automata, according to the Muslim Heritage Society, was published in 1206, so 13th century engineer, although of course he wasn't one at the time. So this is a book of 50 automata. And this particular automaton is titled "A Device for Washing Hands." And so it configures this bird this little human figure, what are obviously sort of built objects, into a mechanism where it's kind of hard to tell what's natural and what's artificial, who's doing what in the service of whom. And I like this figure both for the fact that it's obviously a device, it's some kind of a machine, but also for the ambiguities of its configuration in terms of distributions between humans and non-humans, between natural and artificial. And those are the questions that I want to explore further. Now, my touchstone in the book is this idea of reconfiguration. At the center, I mean, kind of literally at the center of that word, is Donna Haraway's argument that all language, including the most technical, the most mathematical language, is figural. That is, it's metaphoric. It's made up of tropes or of turns of phrase that involve associations across diverse realms of meaning and practice. And following from this, Haraway proposes that we might think about technologies as forms of materialized figuration. That is, technologies are arrangements that affect particular meaningful associations of persons and objects. And I think this is the idea of very much of the thing in the book that just came out by Atelier, Design Things. This idea of that we think about technologies as assemblages, as arrangements. And in the book, I explore the question, how are relations of humans and machines currently figured together or configured in contemporary technological discourses and practices, and how might they be reconfigured or figured together differently, where I'm deliberately there playing on both the sense of figuration as conceptual, as how we think about these things, and as material, how they're actually assembled. And in the latter sense, of course, this word plays really nicely on the words reconfiguration, configuration, reconfigurations, currency in the everyday language of systems development. Now, I want to take a little brief sojourn into one long-standing preoccupation of mine, which is a kind of, I would argue, overly literal approach to the idea of restoring information's body in the form of the embodied sociable robot, in the form of machines that are figured like in either zoomorphic or anthropomorphic ways, in particular within the context of artificial intelligence, with which I've had a long-standing kind of critical engagement. And this is a robot, Mertz, that I describe and work with this example at some length in a paper that's just come out in feminist theory called Subject Objects, where I read an encounter with Mertz. I should say that Mertz is a project of the Artificial Intelligence and Robotics Lab at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And the idea of Mertz was to create a robot that could get out of the laboratory and into the wild, as its creators phrased it. And the wild in this context was the lobby of the Stata Center at MIT. This is this fantastic Frank Gehry building that houses the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. So Mertz was installed in the kind of atrium public space of this building, and then a study was made of the encounters that ensued with Mertz over a period of about 5 days. And in the technical papers that are published about this project, the things that are interesting for Mertz's creators are these various, Mertz was recording data on what input it was getting from passersby, and in particular, which of the words it recognized, and its own visual input as well. And these graphs and pie charts were all analyzed as percentages of correct recognition of human faces. So how many times did Mertz actually register that there was a human face? And correct recognition of robot-directed speech, things that people were saying to the robot. And from these data, the experimenters at least tentatively confirmed their hopes for the possibility that a robot might be able to kind of recruit humans to scaffold its robotic development in a way that in their narrative is modeled on, and therefore implicitly a model for, the socially situated learning of the human infant. So there's a lot packed into here. And as I say, I talk about this at more length in the paper. But one of the interesting things that happens during Mertz's time out in the wild is that, of course, someone comes by and puts up a YouTube video of Mertz. And I've found this video out on YouTube, and I think it's really, really wonderful. So I'm going to play it for you and then just say a few more things about it. And it's subtitled.
Hello, what is your name?
Maybe we could turn it up a little bit.
What is your name is Suchman.
Is what?
Yes or no?
No. Go to.
Say yes or no, please.
No.
Please look at my face.
He's speaking in French. Are you
Say
speaking
yes
French?
or no.
No.
Hello, what is your name?
Go
Martha?
to.
Your name is Harry. Yes or no?
No, it's Martha.
I cannot see you.
I'm here. Hello?
Please look at my face.
What? What did you say?
Please face me directly.
What?
Please face me directly.
So ridiculous.
Answer correctly.
Yeah.
Hello, what is your name?
Martha. And yours? What?
Please do not move too much.
You move too much.
I cannot see you.
Can you
Look
see
at
me
my
now?
face.
Are you seeing me now?
Please face me directly.
What?
You are too far away.
No, I'm not far away. What do you want?
I'm so nervous.
No, don't get
Red
mad.
robot.
Let's go and talk.
Too many words.
Okay.
Oh, too
I
many
don't
words.
understand any language, but I am trying to learn and repeat simple words you say.
Come closer, please.
So you cannot communicate.
Come closer, please.
Am I close enough?
Too far away. Come closer, please.
I think he wants to get kissed.
Stop the spell.
In fact, there is someone.
A lot of fun.
Okay, goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye, huh?
I really love this video, and in the comments under the YouTube video when I first found it, there were people kind of worrying about, that these people were like being really mean to this robot, or, that somehow the robot was being humiliated or denigrated. But actually, I think this is just a delightful encounter. I mean, well, I love the humans, and I also think the robot is quite fabulous. But I'm of course looking for different things in my reading than the creators of Mertz. And in my own reading, and I do quite a close reading of this encounter in the paper, I focus on what so fascinates me here is the kind of fluid boundaries of subjects and objects that I think it demonstrates very vividly. So I'm fascinated by the kind of moment-to-moment shifting choreography of this very lively object and its very obliging subjects. So the Guce and Marta draw on their unremarkably human competencies to alternately kind of shape themselves into what I would call appropriately cartooned subjects to be able to engage reciprocally with Mertz. And then at other moments, so at certain moments, they're kind of being what they think Mertz needs them to be. And then at other moments, they kind of shift back and they reframe the robot as an object of their shared puzzlement and pleasure as they kind of shift their gaze back to each other. And meanwhile, Mertz is there robotically translating these fragments of sound and motion that these noisy objects are emitting into readable signals and enacting its own kind of inbuilt logic of more and less sensible replies. And taken together, I think these are what Donna Haraway has characterized as the experiment's immeasurable results, but immeasurable, but no less illuminating. And so let me now take some further examples from science studies, other approaches to trying to recover the body of information. And one of, I think, the most brilliant approaches is that taken by the anthropologist and STS scholar Natasha Myers in her PhD dissertation, where she's exploring the forms of embodied knowing that occur, in this case, as molecular biologists incorporate an understanding of protein structures. And she means incorporate very literally, how they incorporate knowledge through their engagement with various kinds of physical and virtual models. So these are two images from a paper from her. A paper of hers published in Social Studies of Science, and also of her forthcoming book, which is coming out from Duke University Press. And the left-hand image is Mac Perutz, who is a biologist who is famous for his commitment to three-dimensional models as a means of understanding the structure of proteins, and also for his showmanship in employing these 3D models in his demonstrations. And on the right is a 3D virtual model of a collagen structure from the lab of Natasha's study. And she argues that interactive molecular graphics technologies afford crystallographers the experience of handling and manipulating what are otherwise intangible protein structures. She's a dancer herself, as well as a biologist, and she's therefore very attentive to the ways in which she argues the process of learning these structures, of incorporating knowledge of them, both draws on and also, she argues, reconfigures the scientist's own body. This is a figure from her book. It's showing contemporary interactive tools for crystallographic model building. And the work of using these tools is described to Natasha this way by one of her research subjects, quote, "And physically, you're sitting at your computer, often with the stereo glasses on, and you are physically dragging pieces of protein structure, like amino acids, and sticking them in. You drag it in and you stick it there, and then with your dials or your mouse, you're adjusting it, moving the pieces to get it to fit. So you're physically building with the stereo glasses and the mouse. You're physically building in a model into this electron density." Myers, in understanding what's going on here, draws among other people on Merleau-Ponty, and here's her account of what's going on. She says, protein modelers can be understood to dilate, that's a Merleau-Pontian phrase, to dilate and extend their bodies into the prosthetic technologies offered by computer graphics and interiorize the products of their bodywork as embodied models of molecular structure. And the result she proposes is what she calls an animate assemblage of continually shifting and progressively deepening competency that's enabled through this very kind of intimate conjoining of persons and things. So we're getting here to ways of thinking about the interface as a kind of quite fluid and dynamic boundary between subjects and objects. That's really the point that I want to be making. Another wonderful example of a different aspect of this comes from the work of Dawn Goodwin, one of my colleagues at Lancaster. Dawn was a surgical nurse, decided to come back and get her PhD, and did her PhD on the work of anesthesiologists, the people who put you to sleep during surgery. And she has a very rich and wonderful discussion, but basically she argues that there are three that we can think about the work of the anesthesiologist as a kind of redistribution of agency, a reconfiguration of a very, very vital form of agency, that is literally our what we call our vital signs, our ability to breathe, and a redistribution of that capacity out of the body of the patient into this assemblage of machines and humans competent to read the signs that the machines are emitting, holding that redistribution stable over the course of the surgery, and then, of course, very importantly, at the end of the surgery, effectively kind of regathering that capacity back into the body of the patient. So it's a beautiful illustration of how we might think about reconfiguration. And another really important point that Dawn makes is that in that middle stage, it's not that the body of the patient is no longer part of the assemblage. Actually, the body of the patient is really active. It's emitting all kinds of signs, but those signs are all being read through this arrangement of machinery. So the patient is still there, still present, but very differently, a very different part of the assemblage. Another example from surgery. It's a really, obviously very intense and rich place to look at these things. That teaches another lesson that I think is really important. Comes from Rachel Prentice's work. Rachel's been looking at minimally invasive surgery. So here you see on the left a doctor at what's called a Da Vinci machine. So a surgeon. He's sitting there in this immersive machine with his hands on the remote controls connected to very, very fine instruments that are working on the body of the patient in the foreground. So here's an example of mediation of a very, very intensive kind. Surgeons are now no longer working with literally their hands in the body of the patient, but over at a machine. Now, we might initially think, and it undoubtedly could be and is the case, that this has a kind of objectifying and distancing effect. The surgeon is distanced from the body of the patient. We have all these layers of mediation. But interestingly, Prentice finds something very different. When she talks to surgeons who are experienced at working in this way, they talk about having a much more intimate sense of proximity. So they kind of imagine themselves kind of so that somebody's working on a shoulder. They see themselves kind of inside this shoulder, tinkering away. So phenomenologically, their experience is actually of being immersed much more intimately in the body of the patient than when they were actually had their hands in an incision. So it's a really, I think, important reminder that there's no simple relationship between technological mediation on the one hand and proximity and distance on the other. Now, with that said, a brief comment about, it's true, I've recently joined the International Committee for Robot Arms Control as I've become increasingly concerned about what's going on in the design of configurations that allow the projection of lethal force at a distance. The United States being preeminent, but these drones, in the case of drones, they're being developed in many, many countries. And so on the right side here is an article from the LA Times last week. Some of you may have heard about this. It was on Friday, I believe. And the story is, quote, "A Marine and a Navy medic killed by a U.S. drone airstrike were targeted when Marine commanders in Afghanistan mistook them for Taliban fighters, even though analysts watching the Predator's video feed were uncertain whether the men were part of an enemy force. The 381-page report, which has not been released, concludes that the Marine officers on the scene and the Air Force crew controlling the drone from half a world away were unaware that analysts watching the firefight unfold via live video at a third location had doubts about the target's identity. Now, I should say, if you don't know, that these drone aircraft are operated from a center in the United States in Nevada. It's an international center. Other countries have their drone operation centers in this place as well. So that's the location of the people who are actually operating the drone, half a world away. Now, this incident closely involves another deadly mistake involving a predator in early 2009. In that attack, at least 15 Afghan civilians were killed, including children, after a predator crew mistook them for a group of Taliban preparing to attack a U.S. Special Forces unit. There have been long-standing reports of mistargeting. This is the first time that the mistargeting has killed U.S. Forces. And I think, unfortunately, while it should have raised serious concerns when other civilians were killed, I think this could potentially be quite a turning point in the debates about this form of warfare, where the issue here is about recognition, about targeting. The discourse of the military is that these things are all operated with extremely precise intelligence. Sorting out the good guys from the bad guys is not a problem, but increasingly we're hearing that that's not the case. James Derderian, a political historian, has written so far the book in this area titled Virtuous War. And he writes, at the heart of what he calls virtuous war is the technical capability and ethical imperative to threaten and, if necessary, actualize violence from a distance with no or minimal casualties, that is, to the threatening side, of course, fought in the same manner as they are represented by real-time surveillance and TV live feeds. Virtuous wars promote a vision of bloodless, humanitarian, hygienic wars. Virtuality collapses distance between here and there, near and far, fact and fiction. It widens the distance between those who have and those who have not. And this is the kind of concern that's led me to get involved with this committee, and also is the focus of an emerging research project. But I think it's really important to recognize that we might understand the suicide bomber, among other things, as a kind of poignant response to these developments. That is, if you don't have access to networked satellite systems and high-tech weaponry, what is available is your own body and the ability to put your body in proximity with others, to become yourself a weapon. And that's the sense of the kind of polarization that it seems to me we're seeing happening. And I started to think about these questions with colleagues at Lancaster a couple of years ago. We put on a workshop that we called Warfare and Healthcare, Action at a Distance in Bodies in Contact, because these were colleagues who were doing work on telemedicine, and we were interested in the way in which technology initiatives in both the areas of military technologies and of medical healthcare technologies, there was a big push for action at a distance. So in medicine we have, and I don't know if this is happening in Sweden, but it's certainly happening in the UK and also in North America, these call centers, so your home will be rendered smart but by being instrumented with all sorts of sensors, and you as an elderly person now are hooked in to a call center, and that call center then responds if you need something. And I'll just read you a brief story. This is from a study that my colleagues Maggie Mort and Celia Roberts have been involved in, looking at these call centers. So this is a story from their materials from this project. A young in a small house in Liverpool, England, an elderly woman sits staring out of her window. She wonders about making a cup of tea, but she doesn't stir. Somewhere in a call center, an alarm goes off, indicating that she hasn't opened the fridge for many hours. A phone call is triggered automatically through to her house. She struggles to the phone to hear the voice say she must press 1 if she is okay. But she just replaces the receiver and waits. The phone rings again. This time a call operative asks her by name if she's okay, and a conversation begins. So they see people learning how to manage this arrangement in a way that will actually get them in contact with a real human being. Another, I think, really interesting illustration of these developments and the things that they erase comes from a Dutch documentary. It's called Robot Love. And it's looking at a series of experiments to introduce sociable robots into elder care. And so these are just stills from 2 scenes. So on the left, we see a woman who is part of an experiment around Sony Aibo dogs, where a group of older people are given Sony Aibo dogs, and then the researchers look to see whether they're developing affective relations with the dogs and whether the dogs are providing companionship. And they discover that indeed, it's extraordinary how quickly people create relationships with these robots. But to me, the most telling moment in the documentary, and this is one that doesn't get any commentary from the kind of voiceover narrative, is we see the researcher walking down the hall. She's in the kind of apartment building where the research subjects live, and she walks down the hall and she knocks on the door, and the door opens, and there's this older woman, and she says, "Thank goodness you're here. His tail fell off." And you see the researcher go in and reconnect the tail. And to me, that is the moment where we get a little glimpse of the fact that this little robot is not actually an autonomous, self-sustaining creature. It's going to need maintenance. And there's going to have to be an infrastructure of supporting humans to keep it going. But the dream of the kind of the replacement of humans with robots always erases those elements of maintenance. And the other erasure, of course, is the incredible limitations of the robots. So the image on the right is from another moment in the video where Philips has this sociable robot called the iCat, and it has kind of minimal kind of conversational abilities, and the kind of vision for the iCat is that it's going to be a combination of sort of a companion, but more a kind of a little nurse reminder. So it'll do things like it'll remind you to take your medication at particular times. And so there's scenarios about how this is going to work, but they're in a care home, and they've set up the iCat on a table, and they bring this man in and they sit him down, and you can see the researchers on the sides, taking their notes, and they start this conversation, and the conversation goes pretty well at first, but then the iCat says, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" And the man says, "Well, actually, they're building a new building, and we really want them to put a swimming pool into it. And so if there's any way that you could, and you can see the researchers sort of looking rather, chagrined, because obviously we've run off the rails of the script. So again, and again, those are not moments that are marked in the video, but those are the moments that I see as the ones that give us a little glimpse of how things overflow the nice boundaries and point to the ways in which point to the limits of the stories that we're being told. Okay, so I'm going to conclude by just saying a few words about design. This is a paper that I've just published in the Annual Review of Anthropology, and the title is Anthropological Relocations and the Limits of Design. The paper, I was invited to write a paper that was a kind of reflection on my my work in relation to design, but also at a moment when in anthropology there's a bit of a romance going on with design. There are some anthropologists, people like Paul Rabinow, very well-known anthropologist George Marcus, who are proposing that design, the design studio, design practice might be a kind of model for the future of anthropology. Now, much as I love design, I'm a bit, I think this is a rather romanticized version. So the paper is partly responding to that, but also thinking about the ways in which anthropology itself, when I first was drawn into engagements with design, it was in the 1970s, and it was at a time of reflection within anthropology on the discipline's own history, in particular, anthropology's relation to colonial empire, and increasing attention to the politics of location, the kinds of located accountabilities that I've argued for in relation to design, in relation to anthropology. And so in writing about design's limits in this paper, my argument is that, like anthropology, I think that design needs to acknowledge the specificities of its place, to locate itself as one figure and practice of transformation, among others. And in the paper, I take as my kind of straw. Well, it's not really a straw person. It's a, I don't know it's a legitimate opponent. But it's a project by Bruce Mao, designer based in Toronto, called Massive Change, which many of you may have seen. It toured around. It was a large exhibition. There were many really fine things in this exhibition, including sustainable technologies and so forth. But it was the framing of design that I was reacting to in my readings of these representations. So this is from the Massive Change website, and the text proclaims. Design, it says, design, it's not about the world of design, it's about design of the world. And it goes on. Design has emerged as one of the world's most powerful forces. It has placed us at the beginning of a new, unprecedented period of human possibility, where all economies and ecologies are becoming global, relational, and interconnected. So design here has emerged as a kind of force of nature. Always something to be alert to. And it, operating autonomously, now places us at the beginning of something new, unprecedented, and global. And this announced kind of tipping point of past and future action is a hallmark of new things. So we have capacity, which is represented by this supercomputer that's made kind of more super by a fisheye lens, which promises that we can now, quote, plan and produce desired outcomes through design at an unprecedented scale. And this leads seemingly kind of inexorably via this orange arrow to the global scale, which is this cycle of movement of things. Well, I mean, it seems kind of circular, but presumably it's heading somewhere that we want to go. And this is confirmed by the resulting optimism that we can, or will, for the first time in history, quote, minimize unintended consequences and maximize positive outcomes, delivering innovations like the Hippo roller, which is a polyurethane drum that was designed by two South African designers, Petty Penzer and Johan Jonker, to enable transport of 20 gallons of water over rough terrain with minimal strain on the body. Now, as far as I can tell, this is not itself a project of the Massive Change Initiative. It's a project that was funded and distributed through the World Food Program and other NGOs. But it is the iconic positive outcome. Another figure then, the position of design is further illustrated by this model, in which design moves from being one among the four primary elements of nature, culture, business, and design, although design is at the core. It moves out to being the enveloping, encompassing, and by implication, directing, I guess, force, leading to a kind of variation on what's really a sort of 19th century declaration of the conquest of nature. Nature itself has fallen to the regime of design. And the rhetorical question regarding the future, now that we can do anything, what will we do? Now, admittedly, this is a rather hyperbolic and grandiose example, but you know, if you look around at design rhetoric, it's not without any precedent or successors. And so in the paper, I go back and I kind of look at the genealogy of this proposition that we can do anything through design. And I go back, interestingly, to the 1970s, the same period at which I was entering the field of anthropology, and a very particular and important decade in the history of professional design in the United States in particular. And so I look at this first call for a science of design, which came from Herbert Simon's manifesto, The Sciences of the Artificial, a series of lectures that he delivered at MIT. In 1969. And Simon, as you probably know, he was trained as a political scientist. He received the Turing Award in 1975 for his contributions to artificial intelligence and the psychology of human cognition. And then 3 years later, he received a Nobel Prize in economics for his, quote, pioneering research into the decision-making process within economic organizations. So Simon had a broad design palette that encompassed the multiple sites that were targeted for a science and technology of enhanced rationality in the mid-20th century, so all the way from brains to boardrooms. And for Simon, the road to scientific legitimacy was paved with a requisite reduction in so-called intuitive judgment in favor of demonstrable rationalities, a move from what he referred to as soft cookbooky knowledge to a body of tough, analytic, teachable doctrine. And that's from page 113 of The Sciences of the Artificial. Now, many of you may be familiar with Victor Margolin's collection of responsive essays titled The Politics of the Artificial, where he argues that one result of Simon's paternity is a lineage that's focused, as he said, more on creating models of the design process than on developing a critical theory of practice. And that's, of course, what a lot of the work that has gone on here has been trying to counter. And Margolin observes that Simon's rhetoric naturalized design methods and it embedded them in a kind of technical framework. So in calling for what he calls a more open conception of design activity, he urges a positioning of history and theory and criticism as very central rather than peripheral elements. Again, I think these were calls needed more intensely in the United States, even than here. And he concludes, if designers are going to realize the full potential of design thought, then they should also learn to analyze how the situations that frame design practices are themselves constructed. And that, to me, is the key move. It's a move from a focus on design as something floating, kind of free, in an either universalized or decontextualized set of arrangements, to design as always itself part of particular historical, cultural, political arrangements that in turn have consequences for its possibilities. And for me, this also resonates with what Phil Agre has called for under the name of a critical technical practice. Phil Agre being having received his PhD from MIT in artificial intelligence and then moving into the social sciences and many critical reflections back on technical fields. And he writes this in a way that's directed to artificial intelligence, but I think is very relevant for all of us. He says, of a critical technical practice, instead of seeking foundations, it would embrace the impossibility of foundations, guiding itself by a continually unfolding awareness of its own workings as a historically specific practice. It would make further inquiry into the practice an integral part of the practice itself. It would accept that this reflexive inquiry places all of its concepts and methods at risk, and it would regard this risk positively, not as a threat to rationality, but as the promise of better ways of doing things. So the conditions of possibility for a critical practice, I think, include recognition of, as I said, the specificity of design's location and also the generative limit of design methods, such that a responsible practice is one that's characterized by humility rather than hubris, and that aspires not to massive change, but to modest interventions within ongoing, continually shifting and unfolding landscapes of transformation. And there. And I guess I just want to add, maybe while you're thinking of questions, that as I said at the beginning, I organized this talk to bring things that I thought might be less familiar, rather than to cite all the ways in which many of the things that I'm talking about have a long-standing history here. So, I mean, going back to Pellé's book, Work-Oriented Design of Computer Artifacts, and many of the things that I've learned about how design might be otherwise, given the time that I spent immersed in the Silicon Valley and in Simon's legacy in the United States, most of the things that I learned about how it could be otherwise came from here. So.
Thank you. I have a mic here. Is there anyone who wants to jump to a question immediately? Okay, maybe you will need some time to think. I think something that I was thinking about is that you're giving a lot of examples, like robots, for example, where the kind of assumption about also human body is inherent in the object itself.
Yes.
And I thought it would be interesting to ask you about when it comes to more digital artifacts, like social media artifacts, for example, that does not carry that kind of assumption that visible. What can you say something about that?
Sure. I mean, I have been particularly concerned with, because early on I got into a kind of, as I said, a kind of engagement with artificial intelligence and cognitive science, and really strong claims for the interactivity of machines that imagine them as conversational partners and so forth. So that's quite specific to those projects. But I think the more general points that I wanted to make about units of analysis apply across social, and about distributions, delegations of agency, thinking about the figurations and reconfigurations, both in terms of how are we conceptualizing the humans and how are we conceptualizing the machines, and how are we thinking about the distributions of capacity across humans and machines, are really useful for thinking about any configuration at the interface, basically. And the other thing I think holds really strongly in terms of other kinds of technologies, social media, are these issues about what's being made visible. How are they framed? How are they framed in the discourses about them, as well as how are they framed at the interface in terms of what's made present and what's made absent? What are the taken for granted, assumed, invisible infrastructures? I think it's really fascinating to think about the cloud in terms of its infrastructures. What does it mean to materialize the cloud? In what ways are, I guess I'm particularly kind of oriented to the stories that go along with these new media, and what those stories are making visible, and what they're making invisible.
Can you give us any examples? What stories you find particularly interesting?
Well, for example, stories about the cloud and cloud computing, and I think are another round of dematerialization, which are, I think, unnecessarily mystifying. I think cloud computing could be just as amazing if we actually understood. Actually, I think for me, it would be way more amazing if we really understood the network infrastructures that make it possible. The networks, the server farms, those things, it's a bit like the analysis that I did of the interactions between the people and the robot, whereas roboticists are invested in making all of the work of creating. They want the robot to be autonomous, and that means they have to erase themselves from the picture. Whereas for me, the robot is like much more delightful if I can see all the strings and all the pulleys and all the levers, because it's that combination of humans and machines that I think is the really interesting object. And really and really extraordinary achievement, actually. So I'm against erasures, I guess. I mean, of course, we do it all the time for all sorts of good practical purposes, but we should always be thinking about what we're pushing out of the picture and how can we in the next step bring it back in, even if we're then going to put it in the background again. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Do you want the mic?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
All right. So my name's Tom Hillman. I'm from the University of Gothenburg, north of here. And my question is about where the interface lies. And if we're talking in these terms of the subject, it being between the subject and the object, and yet the subject and the object are kind of one and the same. But also in the same sense, the subject and the object and the interface exist within a, as Anne-Marie Moll talks about, a kind of a fluid space of a network of things and people interacting. And so then that assemblage with an interface exists within a nestedness of assemblages. So how do you account for which interface or where the interface is when you're talking about it?
Right. Well, I think this is a question that can't be answered in principle. It has to be answered in practice. So I think we make interfaces. We make interfaces when we need to articulate a boundary. We need to articulate a front and a back, an object and a subject, and so I think that the question in any instance where either interfaces are being invoked or being well, I guess that's the important thing is when do we invoke the interface, and what kind of work is that doing and for whom? And as a practical matter in design, it does all sorts of really important work. But of course, it also if we reify it or fix it, objectify it, as if it had a kind of self-evident existence, then we lose the ways in which it's actually being made, and the ways in which if we are interested in thinking not about the difference, but we're interested in thinking about the connections, then we might want to have a more fluid kind of understanding of it. So it's, I think the interface is a conceptual device that gets materialized in various ways, and it's a term of art in design, basically.
Happy with the answer? I have another question over here. I think it's on. Try it. It's okay.
Hi, Irina Shklovsky, IT University of Copenhagen. As you were talking, I was thinking my research has to do with relationships and relating through the internet. And you were talking about embodiment, and you were talking about bringing the body back. And one of the things that happens when you talk about relationships and mediation is about being able to talk across distance and sort of disembodied. But there's one quote that's been with me for about a year from doing fieldwork in Kazakhstan, of all places, where an 80-year-old man who had never seen the internet and never used it told me, the internet, that's where you find, that's where you locate people. And in some ways, I think if we think of social media, and if we think, and if we don't focus on the interface, the relating is what actually gets embodied, because the relating happens to people, to bodies and minds. And I think in many ways, if you go beyond design and if you go beyond just thinking about networks in general, when people interface and interact with these technologies, in many ways the embodiment happens naturally because they're talking to people. And I wonder whether some of these critical technical practices can be useful for thinking about sort of some of the simple and very everyday ways of using technology.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, I think they certainly can. I think they can be used in thinking about any relations of persons and artifacts and other persons, and any assemblages of people and artifacts. I mean, I think. I guess I might push back a bit on the idea of people being able to interact naturally, because I think all forms of interaction are as cultural as they are natural, and the thing is that we acquire those competencies at such a young age that and they're so deeply ingrained. So we take them for granted, right? But they are very artful, actually, and also they're always mediated, right? So but again, here I think the questions are how, my inclination again is that it's hard to make statements in general or in principle about this. It's so much about the specificity of different configurations, different arrangements, and what they enable, the ways in which from moment to moment the mediating technologies appear and disappear. And out of that, the ways in which they appear and disappear have a lot to do with relations of design and use. I mean, that's a place where I've argued in the past that the greater the distance, using that term in multiple ways between sites of production and sites of use, the more likelihood there is that there will need to be work done in sites of use to basically translate an artifact into being a familiar, into being something that is at home in that environment, that can be incorporated into a practice and so forth. But again, I think it's these are empirical questions. They need to be determined through particular cases.
Happy with the answer? Sorry.
Does it work? No, it doesn't.
I was not quick enough.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Well, thanks for the presentation. I will try to formulate it. Is like my question is maybe not very professional. Is like you've been talking about design and this examples of technology interacting with humans. I was thinking because I got a little bit like sucked in technological determinism, which is sort of a bit overwhelming. What do you think, like personally, is it like humanity that affects technology more than like technology and design? Because it's sort of, I can put it in the same
Yep.
basket. Like technology is designed as well. So what do you think of that? If I'm clear.
So I'm not sure I maybe followed to the end, but in terms of technological determinism and humans or technologies driving the direction of things, I mean, so much of the work that I've drawn on in science and technology studies is about trying to, in a way, kind of undo the idea that humans and technology are separate things. So everything we do is always simultaneously social and technological. Always simultaneously involves humans and technologies, if we define that term broadly, or artifacts or devices, or and so we kind of can't think about one or the other. That's this idea of configuration, of assemblage. All of these are ways of trying to always have us thinking in terms of the relations, the particular arrangements that we're part of. And so it's never the case that the technology determines what's going to happen. It's never the case that the humans are in control. It's always the case that we're creating particular kinds of arrangements that make some things easier for some people, more difficult for, so that it's full of all sorts of political and moral consequences, and that's kind of where we have to look to see what's driving things. And technologies can be very powerful, but when they're very powerful, they're usually also connected with powerful humans. You know, it's again, it always comes back to the political, the economic, the social arrangements that gather resources in some places, not in others, and so forth. So I guess that, you know, the main thing is we always want to think about those questions in terms of thinking about arrangements of humans and technology, rather than looking to sort of locate power and direction in one or the other. I hope that makes sense.
Still looking a little bit puzzled. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael Jacobson from here at K3. This is a completely different kind of question. I was thinking about the picture at the beginning of your presentation with Margaret Mead at the Cybernetics conference, and it was very peculiar picture. Like, how did she end up there? Did she go through the wrong door or something? And then I was thinking, there seems to be kind of a parallel to you doing your work at Xerox PARC. So I was just wondering, how did you end up there? How did you make that happen?
Yes, that is a big question. I talk about it a bit in the paper that I referenced that's just come out in the Annual Review of Anthropology. But basically, I was a PhD student at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley in the 1970s, and it was a period of great political turmoil. And one of the things that was happening in American anthropology was there was a little green book edited by a guy named Dale Himes called Reinventing Anthropology. And it was a call by a group of anthropologists to bring anthropology home to the United States and to powerful institutions. So it was basically arguing anthropology has a moral obligation not just to be the sort of the instrument that brings back news about, you know, the other, but that we need to do anthropological, critical anthropology of ourselves, effectively, ourselves being white privileged Americans, and there was for example, one of the articles in that book was by a professor at Berkeley named Laura Nader, who does happen to be Ralph Nader's sister. You know, I can imagine what their dinner table conversations must have looked like when they were growing up. So anyway, Laura Nader had written an article called Studying Up, and so this became kind of one of the phrases for this. So I was really captivated by this. I was actually really... just checking the time to see how long I should make this story, but I was really completely enamored of Native American culture, actually, as a student of anthropology. And I thought, you know, the last thing any Native American community needs is another anthropologist studying them. If I really care about them, what I should do is go study the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? It was this idea of going to look at these institutions. So I kind of had that general orientation, but I then became more and more interested in the idea of doing some kind of corporate ethnography. Corporations were black boxes to me and my friends. None of us had ever, as far as we known anybody who worked in a big corporation. But I really wanted to understand, sort of take corporations as a site in which to look at everyday practices of power. And so that led me through a series of circumstances to Xerox, because it's very idiosyncratic. And again, I tell this story at greater length. But, there happened to be a person at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center who had a kind of romantic attachment to anthropology, and had gotten the idea that it would be interesting to have anthropologists sort of involved in the office information systems work that was going on there. And he'd contacted a friend of his at Berkeley. And so there was this little conduit where UC Berkeley PhD students in anthropology were going down to Park. And there'd been a little crowd of them before I arrived who'd done that. So I ended up I ended up at Park. I hadn't thought about technology at all. But of course, then once I was at Park, I got really drawn into a whole series of issues, and then ended up doing my PhD work there, and then staying on. And so it was this little idea on the part of this one, his name was Jeff Rulofson. He was the head of what was called the Office Research Group, and he'd read some Levi-Strauss, and he just thought this was really cool. And he had this friend in the computer lab in the anthropology department at Berkeley, and so they set up this little connection, and then the rest is history.
And why did you leave? Can we ask that?
Why did I leave?
Yeah.
Well, I also talk about that in this paper. And the really short version of that is that somewhat, maybe ironically is the right word, I'm not sure, but when I first came to Park, it was assumed that I was in a laboratory called the System Sciences Laboratory. It was assumed that I was going to be engaged in kind of bringing a different way of thinking about things and looking at things to the table, and there was a very kind of live and let live attitude. Most people had no idea what I was doing. Some people thought it was interesting. Enough people thought it was interesting for me to stay around, and then we were able to build a group. And by the time I left, I was in something called the Knowledge and Practices Laboratory. And so you would have thought that, we'd really made a lot of progress. I mean, now practice had been embraced as, something that everybody had to be attending to. But at the same time, my experience was, the repeated experience was that the ways in which we would talk about technologies and practice, practice was increasingly becoming something that needed to be captured. It needed to be domesticated. It needed to be built into machines. It needed to be, along with everything else. Now we had to get practice under control as well. And so rather than just sort of hearing our stories as these interesting sorts of coming in from the side sorts of provocations, we were now supposed to be delivering up things that could be, could become part of the machine. Yeah. And as we, my experience was that as we tried to resist that and say, look, practice is by definition always going to escape. It's
always messy.
It's going to always escape. Then that, what you're trying to do there. So one example was my colleague Julian Orr, who was looking at repair technicians. And Julian had made this observation in his book talking about machines, that they told stories to each other. They narrated problems with machines. They exchanged knowledge through these stories. And he had been involved in a little project to give technicians two-way radios, so that they could when this was in Colorado, where they were kind of going out in far and wide and didn't get to see each other very often. So the idea was that you're at a machine and you're stuck, or you have a question, and you can just broadcast a kind of open broadcast question, and your colleagues can hear it. Great little project. Well, some of our colleagues at Park decided that they wanted to create a knowledge database of what they called tips. So now the technicians were supposed to write up their knowledge in the form of tips, and then the tips would be put into the database, and then the database could be rationalized. And Julian was saying, oh, but they aren't tips. Like, that's not what these stories are. And so I felt that we were increasingly seen as being recalcitrant in a way, as being. Well, it was when I was told by my manager that I was resistant to change that I thought,
Maybe
this is
I am.
interesting. What's going on here? So it's an interesting, very complicated dynamic, I think, where sometimes at moments when it seems like you're being really successful and what you're arguing is being embraced, it turns out to be a bit of a deadly embrace, that actually closes down the space for difference that was there before. And that's my kind of, working hypothesis at the moment. I mean, I still trying to kind of puzzle through these things. So it just became too difficult to stay there, really.
It's an interesting story. I would just like to, if there's nobody else having a question, I would just ask you, what are you looking into now, and what do you want to look at in the future, near future?
Well, I mean, several things. I still continue to be really interested in. We had a wonderful workshop yesterday about innovation. I'm really interested in kind of critical engagement with discourses of innovation. I mean, as I said at the beginning of our meeting yesterday, there's constant talk about innovation. We need more of it. It needs to happen faster. And almost never does anybody say, well, actually, what counts as innovation? Who decides? How do things get declared to be new or not? What are the politics of that? So I continue to be really interested in that and working on that with Andre and Laura, who are both here. But the other thing that I mentioned that I'm starting to look at is are these questions of remote control, particularly in the area of military systems. And I have a lot of concern about that, both the drone aircraft and also now they're taking remotely controlled robots, which have been used in Afghanistan and other places as surveillance devices. So I can sit at a distance, and I have a robot that's instrumented with a camera, and it's a pack bot, so it's really good at navigating. And I send it into a house, and it feeds back images. Those same robots are now being armed with mega guns and weapon systems. And so this is part of the ongoing enormous industry in the United States of the production of military technologies. So I'm trying to think of what I could do in relation to that would be that would support people who are working against these developments, but in some way draw on my own work. And reading James Sterdarian's Virtuous War was, he talks about what he calls the military entertainment complex, this convergence of the Hollywood special effects, gaming, simulation, interface design in the area of military technologies. So I'm going to be spending some time in the new year sort of on a bit of a reconnaissance mission to try to figure out whether there's a way that I can bring my own background in human-computer action, interface design, to bear on both understanding really what's going on with these systems, and also, I think the two media stories that I showed you of these mistakes in the targeting are a really important area, because the whole thing is premised on the fact that we can tell the good guys from the bad guys. And if that really is called into question, then it's much harder to sustain the legitimacy of this kind of warfighting.
development. Yeah. Mm. I think we should say thank you. Because you have a cold and you will have a long formal day tomorrow.
Yes.
Thank you so
Okay,
much
very
for coming
welcome.
here and for your talk.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Thank
inviting
you.
me.